Shalom Aleichem. Today is Yom Hamishi B'Shabbat, Thursday, Kaf He Be'elul Tavshin Peh He, according to our calendar, according to our tradition, Yom B'Riyat HaOlam, or at least according to one opinion, and that corresponds to the 18th of September 2025, Leminyan HaOmoth, according to the Gregorian calendar. And as we mentioned last time, in the wake of having studied together essentially all of Sefer HaMadar of Rambam over a period of time, having seen what Rambam writes in Ilchot Yesodei Torah and in Ilchot Teshuvah and elsewhere, we mentioned occasionally, without usually digressing to any great extent, that there are other views and opinions and approaches to various aspects of what we're discussing here. And I thought today we would begin looking at what you can see here on the screen, Hilchot Piskei Riaz, Rabbeinu Yeshayahu Aharon, Zichrono Livracha. That's the Rashi Tevot. Rabbeinu Yeshayahu, Rabbeinu Yeshayahu Aharon, Zichrono Livracha, from Italy. He was the grandson of Rabbeinu Yeshaya Harishon. That's why he's called Aharon. The Reed, Rabbeinu Yeshaya the Trani, from the town of Trani in southern Italy, did not have sons, as I recall, and this was a grandson from his daughter. And the Riaz wrote a sefer which I think is unfortunately overlooked and not sufficiently studied. Should be studied a great deal more, I believe. His writings in general, which are, as the name implies, Piskei Riaz, just like Piskei Reed, are Pesakim. They deal with the Psak Halacha as it emerges from the Talmud. The difference being between the Reed and the Riaz, that the Reed wrote a kind of a work similar in many ways to the Rif or to the Rosh. In other words, quoted the Sugyot or certain parts, statements from the Sugya in their original language, and then explained what he thought needed explanation. And would often mention the Rif, for example, and would sometimes disagree with the Rif. He would mention Rabbeinu Hananel. He mentions Hamoreh, the teacher, is Rashi. Those are some of the main Chachamim that he mentions. He mentions Rabbeinu Tam, Rabbeinu Yaakov, he calls him, and others. Interestingly, now the Riaz did approach things differently. He was influenced obviously by the Rambam, at least to this extent, and maybe more than this extent, but certainly to this extent, that he wrote his work, Piskei Riaz, in Mishneh Hebrew, no Aramaic, and it's not he doesn't quote the Sugyot and then add a perush. He sums it up in his own words in Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, and he's very original, but less radical than his grandfather, the Reed, who sometimes comes up with totally new opinions. The Riaz less so. Now, here in Perek Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Helek Olam Haba, at the end of Sanhedrin in the Talmud Bavli, it's Daf Sodi Amud Aleph, the Riaz goes into some very fundamental and important discussions regarding both halachic and not necessarily such halachic matters, also hashkafic matters. And some of these things pertain to some of the concepts we've looked at in the past. So let us begin at the beginning. So the Mishnah states, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem halak olam haba. We discussed olam haba a great deal, of course, in Ilchot Teshuvah. All of Am Yisrael, any Jew, in principle, has a portion, ba'olam haba. but there are exceptions. ואלו שאין להם חלק לעולם הבא, האומר אין תחיית המתים ואין תורה מן השמיים ואפיקורוס. So immediately the Riaz begins at this point. This is what the Mishneh states. So generally a Jew has a Halak Olam Haba. The exceptions mentioned by the Mishneh here, first of all, are he who says En Tahiyat HaMethim. So you also immediately understand there is a connection between Tahiyat HaMethim and Olam Haba. And a person who rejects the concept of Tahiyat HaMethim, by definition, does not belong in Olam Haba. Wa'en Torah min hashamayim, and the Torah is has v'shalom, all very well and nice and very impressive, but it's not min hashamayim. It's not from a divine source. And the third opinion, or a third belief or lack of belief, is epikuros in Greek. Basically, a person who rejects the possibility of prophecy, of nevuah. Okay, the Riaz writes as follows: Ikashya daha beferek kamad Rosh Hashanah kahashev tuva. You may ask, in the first perek of Rosh Hashanah, it mentions other people who do not have Halak L'Olam Haba. Damrenan Hatham, Aval Haminim, Waha Mosaroth, in other words, the Mosarim, Waha Meshumadim, Wa'apikorosim, Washekafru B'Torah, Washekafru B'Tiyat HaMethim, Washeparashu Midarchet Zibur, Washenathanu Hitvatham Ba'aras, Ba'aras Ahim, Washehata'u, Washehattiu Harabim, Keron Yoravam Ben Avad, Wahavero, Yoradim L'Reinom, so we have here a list of various types of posheim, criminals. Some are referred to as binim, which we studied in Hilchot Teshuvah and the Rambam, Perek Shlishi. This has to do with people who believe in completely false and pernicious systems of belief or worship. So this includes Jews who worship Avodah Zarah, it includes an atheist, it includes it was often a term used for the early Christians in many contexts. Masaroth refers to Musarim, those who essentially traitors to the Jewish people, in that they hand over a fellow Jew to a non-Jewish authority to be jailed or punished or killed or what have you, or even their property, not just their lives. Meshumadim are in general people who turn their back on the Torah altogether and consider themselves one hadmin ha'amim, as Rambam writes. Wa'apikorosim we mentioned, V'shekafru b'Torah, that has to do with Torah min hashamayim. V'shekafru b'Tiyat HaMethim, as we discussed. V'sheparashu midarchei zibur, again this has to do with removing oneself from Am Yisrael. We discussed this in the past as well. Those who, when Am Yisrael are in dire straits, and let's say, and as a result, a fast day is announced, is declared, and this person does not consider himself part of Am Yisrael for this purpose. He thinks that it's unnecessary for him to get involved, or to fast, or to take part in such activities. That is someone who is poresh midarchet zibur. V'shenathanu hitatham b'aretz ha'ayim. In other words, people who acted in a criminal and cruel and often violent fashion, or threatening fashion towards people at large, because they were in a position of power and were able to get away with it, and therefore they literally caused everyone to fear them. And you can probably imagine quite a number of people who would quite readily could be labeled in that fashion. I'm particularly thinking of the entire judicial and legal apparatus in this country and in other countries, for example, and the way they abuse their powers. And those who sin grievously and cause others to sin grievously, such as Yerovam ben Nevat and those like him, Yoradim legehenom, they, when they die, go to, or are judged, shall we say, legehenom, unidonim ba ledorei dorot, for all time. In other words, without end. Shene'emar, as it states in the Pasuk, in Yeshayahu, ויצאו וראו בפגרי האנשים הפושעים בי כי תורעתם לא תמות ואישם לא תכבה גיהנום קלה והם אינם קלים והכה להשיב כל הנח. So the question that the Riaz is asking is, all these are mentioned in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. They're not mentioned in this Mishnah here in Sanhedrin. What are we to make of this? ויש לומר, so we can explain as follows, שזה התנא כולל כולן בכלל אפיקורוס. That all these various categories that we just mentioned, that this Tana in our Mishnah here in Sanhedrin includes them all in the term Epikuros. Shahapodashim midarche tzibur bichlal Epikuros hem. If a person feels that they are not connected to the rest of Am Yisrael and they're free and independent agents completely, why they are included within the purview of this concept of epikoros. A person who rejects some of the most basic, fundamental concepts in the Torah, just as nevuah, prophecy, is an essential and fundamental concept. You cannot believe in the Torah, you cannot be a good Jew and not believe in nevuah. In the same way, that's what the Riaz is getting at. In the same way, you cannot be a good Jew and be a poresh midarkei tzibur. You cannot say, well, I was not mehalel Shabbat, and I didn't eat any ma'achal asur, I didn't eat any forbidden food, and I did not transgress any specific mitzvah of the Torah, so why are you telling me that I'm a rasha gadol? The answer is because perisha midarkei tzibur is the greatest avera, the greatest het that one could imagine. It is so great that it's not mentioned specifically by the Torah as such. What does that mean? He explained, Shemapilim ematham ala berioth. Again, that they do whatever it is they wish to do, and they abuse their power and accrue to themselves wealth and power and status while spreading fear and terror amongst their fellow Jews. And those who are musarim, as we mentioned before, the Riaz says, Kulam kafranim hem. They're all kofrim. A person who does any of these things obviously could not do so if he was not a kofir. How could you, for example, be poresh midarkei tzibur? How could you be a moser if, for example, you inform on a Jew to some non-Jewish criminal authority in order that they should steal his property, and you will get a kickback, for example. That's why a moser would do it. He wouldn't do it for no reason, one imagines, or something along those lines. He somehow benefits. That is much more more serious a crime than regular averot. That's the point. כולם כפרנים הם. וקרנן בו בנפש אשר תעשה ביד רמה. In other words, they can all be understood, all be included under the rubric of the pasuk, referring to a person who acts sinfully biyad rama, in other words, brazenly, without care, without thought, without not in the least bit embarrassed, or because everyone sees what they're doing. It's not as if they do these things entirely behind closed doors. وهم كمشومدين لخول التوراة كلها. A person who does any of these things is to be considered, and clearly is, a meshumad l'chol Torah kula. He cannot really believe in anything in the Torah if he behaves in this way. Uchadamranan b'ferek hasholeach get, as it says in Masechet Gitin, Sefer Torah, Tefilim, Umezuzot, Shekatavan min, Umasur, Pesurim. This is understood. This is halakha pesuka, according to all, that a min, or a muser, a Jew, who is a min, shall we say, he worships Avodah Zarah, or he's an atheist, or a muser, as we described what a muser is. If he writes a pair of tefillin, or writes a mezuzah, that mezuzah is pesula. שנאמר וקשרתם וכתבתם כל שאין בקשירה אין בכתיבה. In other words, you have to be kasher to write such a thing. You have to believe in this thing that you're dealing with. You have to believe in the Torah. So you see clearly from this beraita in Masechet Gitin, the fact that a min is considered to have left Judaism behind is not perhaps such a chidush, but a moser, he's a Jew, but he makes a living by informing on fellow Jews to the, shall we say, the Tsarist authorities in order to find hidden Jewish young boys, so they will not be taken away for 25 years of military service, which was just another way of causing them to cease being Jewish. So if that's what he does, he's a muser, and such a person is clearly kofer b'chol Torah, is a meshumad. Umashma shehamasur eino b'kshira. In other words, he's not even, he doesn't believe in the Torah. Shehu kofer b'chol Torah kula. V'domer la'epikoros v'la'omer en Torah min hashamayim. Okay, so according to the Riaz, all these various categories mentioned in Rosh Hashanah can be understood to fall under the category of epikoros. Wahamoreh, this is Rashi. The Riaz also uses this terminology that he learned from his grandfather, the Reed. Hamoreh, Rashi en gores sham sheparashu midarchei tzibur. Wahamoreh en gores sham sheparashu midarchei tzibur. Rashi, in his Girasah of the Talmud, the Masechet Rosh Hashanah, does not have the term, the category Poresh midarchei tzibur over there. Da'achi garsenan la b'seder olam. And we have another source where it appears in this fashion. In Seder Olam, it says there, sheparashu midarchei tzibur kehor aminim v'amasorot, shekulam parashu midarchei tzibur hem nikraim. ופרשו מדרכי ציבור לא מילתה בענפי נפשי ועיין מה שכתבתי שם. In other words, פורשים מדרכי ציבור is a general term, and minim and masorot, for example, are the more specific categories. So that's a more general category. But that doesn't change anything that we just said. Furthermore, Rabbeinu Moshe, that's the Rambam. Rabbeinu Moshe כתב בפרק שלישי להלכות תשובה. Hamisha him anikraim minim. There are 5 categories of minim, as you recall. We studied this. Ha'omer en sham Eloah, wa'en la'olam manhir. In other words, that's an atheist. Ha'omer she'en en sham manhir, aval hem, sheyesh sham manhir, aval hem shenaim o yoter mishnayim. He believes in some kind of deity, but not one, 2 or more. Ha'omer sheyesh sham ribon echad ela shehu guf. Uva'al Tamuna, and he who believes in one deity, but believes that this deity, this God, has a physical, corporeal form. V'chen ha'omer she'eno levado rishon v'thor lakol, and Rambam continues then in Chot Teshuvah, he who claims that this God exists and what have you, but he is not he did not precede all of existence and reality as we see it. And he who worships some other god or demigod in order to be some kind of go-between the person and Hashem. All right, so that's what the Rambam wrote. The Riaz now relates to this and says, "Udvaro hen hus mishiktat Talmud." In other words, the Rambam here is stating things that the Talmud did not state. It's not. You will not find these statements in the text of the Talmud. To what he's referring. Or for instance, does it state in anywhere in Chazal that he who believes that Hashem exists but is corporeal, has some physical form, is a min? It doesn't say such a thing, as the Ravad also famously points out. Nor does it say explicitly that he who worships some kind of go-between. It's not explicit, perhaps. All right, so the Riaz says some of the words of Rambam here are Rambam's own statement or chidush, and not to be found in the Talmud. Ve'omnam ki chen hada'at machra'at. So the Riaz says it's true. It's not mefurash in Chazal, but it makes more than sense. It seems impossible not to accept all of these words of the Rambam. V'chen peshutam shemikraot, and this is the simple, plain meaning of everything that we find in the Tanakh. Sha'akadosh Baruch Hu eno guf u'ba'al temuna, k'mo shene'emar ve'elmi tedameyun el u'mad demuth ta'archulo. In other words, the pasuk there in Yeshaya also states that to what can you compare? What form could you possibly imagine Hashem has, which implies what Rambam is saying, that a person who believes that I believe in Hashem and I do what the Torah states and everything is fine, except that I think he's a physical being of tremendous proportions, shall we say. That does not square with the simple meaning of what we find in the Torah and the Nevi'im. וכל הדמיונות שראו הנביאים אינן אלא כדרך הנבואה. And any images or visions that the Nevi'im saw and then committed to writing that we see, these were visions within the context of prophecy, not to be understood literally. כמו שנאמר, וביד הנביאים אדמה. In other words, Nevi'im get some, they see a vision or image or some mashal which they understand, from which they understand whatever it is they're supposed to understand. כמו שנאמר, וביד הנביאים אדמה, שהקדוש ברוך הוא היה מראה לו דמיון נכבד, כדי שידע הנביא כי זו הנבואה באה לו מאת הקדוש ברוך הוא. The information, the vision that the Navi would perceive would be shown to him, so that it would be clear to him that what he is receiving is not some, not just things that he imagines, but they are from Hashem, directed to him so that he will understand certain things. Aval Ikar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Eno Sof. And also it could be that it should say here no guf. In other words, which makes more sense. But not that the Navi would imagine from anything that he saw. For instance, if a Navi describes Hashem sitting on a throne, not that he imagined that there's a physical throne, there's a physical king, as it were, sitting on the throne. And anyone who has any understanding must agree to these statements. However, there are people, there are Jews, who are good and righteous Jews, wishing and attempting to do the right thing, but on this issue they're completely misguided. A person who makes this mistake, he's wrong, but he's not amin. That's the difference. So the Riaz here is agreeing essentially with the Ravad and not with the Rambam. Shimkenu adavar, ech lo pirsama Torah al davar ze velo gilu hachmei Talmud lehodi al davar ze begalui. If this was so essential that a Jew recognize and understand this fact that Hashem is not about Tamuna, and if you think so, then you're a kofer legamre. Then how could this not be mentioned explicitly? ולהזהיר נשים ועמי הארץ על כך שלא יהיו מינים ויעבדו עולמם. People would need to hear this so that they will not be excluded from עולם הבא. הלא כמה איסורים קלים כגון איסור מוקצה וכיוצא בו. חיברו חכמים כמה הלכות והרבו כמה דקדוקים להעמיד כל דבר על מכונו. Even when it comes to relatively minor isurim, midivre sofarim like muktzeh, much was written to explain and to spell things out. ועל דבר זה שכל האמונה תלויה בו ויש בו כרת בעולם הזה ובעולם הבא, איך לא הורו חכמים על דבר זה בגלוי? How can this be? It's a very powerful question. He continues, אלא ודאי לא הקפידו לכך. אלא, in other words, it's true. A person who believes such a thing is foolhardy, to put it mildly, and is bereft of true understanding. However, nevertheless, Yamin Adam Hayehud Kafi Sichlo. The Chachamim understood that various people, different human beings, are on different levels, intellectually, spiritually, and people will understand such things not necessarily in an identical fashion. وَأَفِيلُ هَنَشِيمْ كَفِي مِعُدْ سِخْلَانِ. They understand what they understand, all people, men, women, children. شَنَمَار مُشَيْعَ عَلَى وَشَلَوم شَمَعَ يِسْرَائِلَ هَشَمْ إِلَوْكَيْنُ وَشَمْ إِحَادٍ وَشَمَعَ لَشَون شَمُعَا وَلَشَون كَبَّلَا. In other words, Shema Yisrael, he's explaining the pasuk. We all know that the word is translated often as Hear, O Israel, but it's nothing to do with hearing in the auditory fashion, in the auditory sense. It has to do with understanding or receiving, like the word Shemu'ah. Something that we learn in the Torah, Mipia Shemu'ah, is by tradition. Walashon Kabbalah, Sha'al Pi Shemu'ah Wa'al Pi Kabbalah, Yamin Davar Zeh, that a person must accept and internalize this idea. V'lo nathan Moshe Torah liYisrael ela b'derech emunah u'b'derech kabbalah. In other words, as he's about to explain, it is not a requirement that a person become a great philosopher to be a good Jew. That's what he means to say, as we're about to see. Ela b'derech emunah u'b'derech kabbalah. A Jew is to accept what the Torah teaches him and what he is able to perceive and understand. וכן חכמי המשנה וחכמי התלמוד לא נתעסקו אלא בדרך קבלה ובדרך אמונה. In other words, we don't see Hazal having written philosophical treatises on these subjects. وَلَا هَرُوا لِدْرَوش وَلَحْكَار عَنْ إِنْيَانْ هَإِلَهُوث وَعَنْ إِنْيَانْ شَرَحْ خُمُوث كَلَامٍ. In other words, philosophy and what have you. We don't find that Chazal instruct us that we must do so. In fact, you can find in Chazal statements to the opposite effect regarding Chokhmah Yewanif, Greek knowledge and Greek wisdom. وَإِمَّا يُيَحِدِيم شَيُوا بِكِيِّم بَهِمْ. And if we do see it, and it's true that we do find some of the Chachamim were more familiar with these things. لَا يُمَرِمْ بَهِمْ لَرَبِيم. But it was not something that was taught to the general public. It was something that was learned and discussed in private or with very specific people. The Torah does not instruct us to delve into all manner of philosophical discussions. And he continues in this vein, and the Riaz says as follows: Hine ma amar ha-sadiq, referring to Eov, v'achokma me'ayin timoseh. Elohim hevin darka v'hu yada et mekomah. V'yomer la'adam he nir'at Adonai hi chokhma v'sur mera bina. So what do we see in these pesukim? All these pesukim are to be found there in Eov. Perhaps we should just glance at them for one moment.
You also see from this that the Riaz disagrees with the Rambam on karet, because I think 2 paragraphs up he says karet be'olam hazeh and olam haba.
Ba'olam haba, nachon. That is true. Quite right. A very correct comment. Hazaku Baruch. Okay, let us open up Sefer Eov. Sefer Eov Perek Kaf Harith Pasuk Yod Bet over here. והחוכמה מאין תימצא ואין זה מקום בינה. All right, well, we're not going to delve into the deeper meaning of all these pesukim, but we'll try and understand why the Riaz is quoting these specific pesukim. And it goes on to say, now, first of all, the simple meaning that one can glean from these words, from where can wisdom be, where can it be found? Where's a makom bina? In other words, it's beyond human understanding. Many things are beyond human understanding. As the next pasuk goes on to say, Lo yada' enosh erka, v'lo timaseh be'eretz ha'hayim. In other words, in this world, wisdom is a rare thing. Sometimes beyond human comprehension, sometimes beyond the abilities of any human being. Pasuk Kaf says something similar. Wa'chokhma mi'ayin tovo wa'eze mekom bina. Again. And so it goes on to say further, Wa'ne'ilma mi'ne chol hai. There are things that are hidden from all created beings, including the wisest of men. U'me'of hashamayim nistara. In other words, even the birds, as it were, the fowl that are in heaven, they're closer to heaven than we are, you would, in some sense, but they cannot obviously see it either. And it goes on to say in Pasuk Kaf Gimel, which is the Pasuk quoted by the Riaz also, Elohim hevin dorka, but Hashem, He understands, He knows the true workings of the world and all manner of things that are beyond us. V'hu yada'et mekomah. The place of Chokhmah and how it is to be achieved and how it is to be understood. And then at the end of it, it says here, وَيَوْمَ الْأَدَمْ هَنْ, and therefore, what is the maskana that a human being must understand? The last pasuk, وَيَوْمَ الْأَدَمْ هَنْ يِرْأَثْ أَدُنَاي هِي Chokhmah. The true Chokhmah of a human being, the greatest Chokhmah, is Yir'at Hashem. وَسُور mera bina, and that which flows from true Chokhmah is bina, is a intuitive and more specific understanding, which is sur mera, not to do evil, to do good, to try and understand what is right and do the right thing, and and stay away from anything that is evil. How is evil defined? By the Torah. And that is the highest level of chokhmah that a person can achieve. We return to the words of the Riaz. הנה מה אמר הצדיק איוב והחוכמה מאין תימצא etc. אלוהים הבין דרכה והוא ידע את מקומה ויאמר לאדם הן יראת אדוני היא חוכמה וסור מרע בינה. הלכה בפירוש, you see from these pesukim, says the Riaz, שלא נברא האדם אלא לירא מהקדוש ברוך הוא. Man is created first and foremost to recognize, to be aware of Hashem, not to understand him in some precise metaphysical way, which is anyhow largely beyond human understanding. Ela lira mi'HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Once you're aware of Hashem, then you have to fear him, which means, first of all, accepting his malchut, kabbalat malchut shamayim. And that's the purpose of Kriyat Shema twice a day, first of all. And everything else that we do as well. Every time you drink a glass of water and you say, Baruch Shakol Niyabid Varo, you are being Yorem Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Everything we do is to be understood and is directed towards this goal. ולסור מרע, ולא להתבונן במעשים הנוראים של הקדוש ברוך הוא. In other words, here the Riaz seems to be criticizing a Rambam statement in Chot Yesodei Torah that one of the ways of understanding, or one of the things that we should do we can do and should do in order to have a greater understanding, a greater appreciation of Hashem, is to be aware of study Hashem's Bariah, etc., which means science in many ways. The Riaz places much less stock in such a claim, and he says, ולא להתבונן במעשים הנוראים של הקדוש ברוך הוא. וחכמי ישראל שהיו בקיאים באלה החוכמות, סיתמום וסתרום. Those Chachamim who were well acquainted with such things did not discuss them openly, generally. ולא רצו לפרסמם רבים. They did not wish to publicize. ולא חששו ללמד לשום אדם שאין הקדוש ברוך הוא גוף. Nor did they constantly stress this point that Rambam did stress and found necessary to emphasize, that Hashem is without any physical form. She'en hashash b'davar ze kasher be'ati, because this is not, even though it's true, no question that it's true, but Emunat Yisrael is not teluya, does not depend on this specific understanding, this particular point. Now you may ask, says the Riaz, all right, what about the fact that we find in Torah explicitly? It says, "V'nishma'otem od lenafshotechem, ki lo re'item kol temuna." Why would you not understand from this pasuk, which the Rambam may well bring as a proof or as a foundation for his approach, that the Torah does tell us that you must be very wary and careful not to make this mistake. Ki lo ritem kol tmuna. Lo, so the Riaz says, Lo ba katuv lazhir, ela shelo la'asot tmuna. The purpose of those pesukim, if you read the pesukim, peshutam, you find that the meaning is part of the isur of Avodah Zarah, to represent Hashem in some fashion, by creating some kind of an idol or artifact that represents Hashem. That is asur. You did not see a tmunat Har Sinai, and you are not allowed to do such a thing. לא בא כתוב להזהיר אלא שלא לעשות תמונה, כמו שכתוב בסוף הפסוק, פן תשחיתון, ועשיתם לכם פסל תמונת כל סמל, as the pasuk itself explains itself. אבל אם יחשוב אדם שהקדוש ברוך הוא בעל תמונה, but if a person nevertheless thinks mistakenly that this is the case, that Hashem has some physical form, לא הקפידה התורה בכך, the Torah does not specifically discuss this. וכמה היו מחכמי התלמוד הקדושים, שמהם תצא תורה לישראל, שלא נתנו ליבם להתבונן בעניין האלוהות. There were many great Chachamim in the time of the Talmud, and one could add as well later, after the time of the Talmud. Some of the greatest Chachamim, and we see nothing regarding such studies or such philosophical endeavors. We hear nothing about this, that they were involved in such things. Ela hevinu hamikraot kipshutam. They understood the Pesukim, the Torah, in a, shall we say, uncomplicated. I wouldn't say incorrect. Not when it says kipshutan, it doesn't mean to take things that cannot be understood literally, to take them literally. It means to understand things in a straightforward, uncomplicated manner. ולפי תומם חשבו כי הקדוש ברוך הוא בעל גוף ותמונה, and there were some people. Riaz was aware of certain Chachamim, and there were some of whom we know, not in Chazal, which you could perhaps misunderstand from here. That's not what he means. But there were some Chachamim in the generations before the Riaz, before the Rambam, and during that time, and also perhaps after, who thought such a thing. וחלילה שנקרא מינים לאשר נאמר עליהם לקדושים אשר בארץ המה. And it would be completely wrong, and therefore has v'shalom to make such a claim against such people. ואומנם, however, מה שכתב רבנו משה בפרק א' מהלכות יסודי התורה, ופירש שם שהקדוש ברוך הוא אינו בעל גוף ותמונה, כולם דברים נוכחים הם. The Riaz wants you to understand, it's not that he believes that Hashem is corporeal. He doesn't think so for a moment. And what the Rambam, he says the beginning of Hilchot Yesodei Torah, the beginning of Mishneh Torah, is completely 100% correct and true. But even if a Jew doesn't understand or delve into such a matter, and therefore doesn't form a clear opinion on that particular point, this is not a central and essential aspect of being a good Jew. However, אבל מה שכתב בסוף הלכות תשובה, צריך אדם לייחד עצמו להבין ולהשכיל בחוכמות המודיעין לו את קונו. This now goes back to what we mentioned earlier about studying various other kinds of chokhmot. It could be science, it could be philosophy, in order to become more aware and understand more profoundly things about Hashem. So here he mentioned one such place at the end of Hilchot Teshuvah, which we saw recently. וכן כתב ברוב מקומות, and this he mentioned elsewhere, as we saw also in Hilchot Yesodei Torah, הדברים הללו אינן מדרך תורתנו. The truth is, here the Riaz openly and unequivocally challenges Rambam's position. He doesn't accept it. He says, אינן מדרך תורתנו. This is not the case. Science is good, wonderful, and it happens to be absolutely true. One cannot deny what Rambam says, that if a person begins to more fully understand the Bria, then this can definitely add to Yirat Shamayim and to Hitpa'aluth, to being amazed and in awe of Hashem. That is true, but it's not necessary. It's not something that the Torah demands. שחכמי התורה הזהירו שלא ללמד במעשה מרכבה ושלא לדרוש במעשה בראשית לרבים. The fact is that many such esoteric, mystical and philosophical undertakings were explicitly proscribed. Chachamim were instructed not to teach these things to most people, to the vast majority of people. כמפורש במסכת הרי"ע. ולפיכך נזהרו חכמי ישראל הקדמונים מלחבר בהם שום ספר. And that is why you will not find books on these topics. ומה שהיו יודעים בהם, כולו היה על פי הקבלה שהיו מקבלים יחידים. And that which was known was kept unwritten, בעל פה, קבלה איש מפי איש, and only for very few individuals. ולא מהספרים שחיברו בהם חכמי אומות העולם. It was not the way of Chazal to study and immerse themselves in the writings of the various חכמי אומות העולם, people from other nations, שהם נוטים כולן למינוף, because much of that, what you find there, will lead one to minuth, to either to atheism or to epikurosus, in other words, rejecting the concept of nevuah and hashgacha. Shomerim en Torah min hashamayim, and usually such people, such Gentile philosophers, would not accept that Torah is min hashamayim. V'cham choshavim she'olam kadmoni, that the universe exists independently, separately, and concomitantly with Hashem, or with His God, that they imagined. V'chofrim b'meh shekatuv b'reshit bara Elohim, and therefore they cannot really accept or internalize what the Torah states, Bereshit bara Elohim, that everything begins from there, V'chol ha'inyan, and everything that we find there. Clearly, you see from all of this that the Riaz was very aware of the ferment that was already taking place in the Jewish world in his time, and he had thought about these things a great deal. And although he had learned from the Rambam a great deal, and he mentions Rabbeinu Moshe frequently in his Piskei Halacha as well, not always agreeing perhaps, but frequently he does agree. And he definitely learned from the Rambam to the style, to write in this style in Lashon HaKodesh, bilevad, not in Aramaic, or not some admixture of the two. When it comes to this matter, he was quite critical of Rambam's approach. And he says further, V'hinei Aristoteles, you know who that is, of course, Shehu Rabban al kol ha-philosophi. In other words, at least in his time, Aristotle was considered the greatest of all the philosophers, although there are actually many who would disagree. And many have said before and since that that title should be given to Plato or others perhaps. At any rate, Aristotle was actually much more problematic from a Torah perspective, because he was a materialist. He believed in a material interpretation of reality, whereas Plato believed in the primacy of ideas before anything material. So, with regards to Aristotle, Shehu Rabban al kol ha-philosophi, u'memo hem shotim, u'sfaro hem hotim, u'dvaro hem divrei minuth, Shehu omer she'en HaKadosh Baruch Hu mashgiach al bnei Adam, כמו שכתב בשמו רבנו משה במורה הנבוכים בפרק דעות בני אדם והשגחה. That's the first one you see from this, that the Riaz did study Moreh Nevuchim. So it's not that he's not writing these things from lack of knowledge. He was Chacham Pil'i Mamash, as was his grandfather the Reed. I should add here in parentheses that it's unfortunate, but it's one of those realities of hashgacha which we cannot explain, that their writings were lost to us for so long and only more recently rediscovered. Shall we say 100 years ago or something like that, or a bit more, 150 years ago, some of them began to be rediscovered and published. Similar to, for example, Rabbeinu Menachem ben Shlomo HaMeiri, who was also a tremendous Chacham, truly Pil'i, awesome in every way. But he wrote voluminously, and his writings are me'irei einayim. They're mamash, they cannot be overlooked. They must be studied. but they were, for various reasons, they somehow survived almost miraculously in one or two manuscripts here and there, which were discovered in more recent times. And today we have the tremendous zechut to study the works of these tremendous chachamim. And the Riaz is in that same category. His writings were mentioned here and there by certain people who had seen them and quoted from them sporadically, but we did not have all their writings. And by the way, what we're reading now, what we're learning from now, is Kuntres Ra'ayot of the Riaz on Masechet Sanhedrin. The Riaz wrote his writings divided into two sections. In other words, there was the Psakim, in which he gave you the Sikum, the summary of the Sugya and the Halakha Pesukah. He mentioned various opinions occasionally, and he gave made it clear what in his view, what the Halakha should be. And as a separate companion volume to that, on every Masechet, every matter, he would write Kuntres Rayot, in which he would explain in greater detail why he reached that conclusion. So he gives you first the halakha without telling you necessarily all the thought and iyun behind that maskana. But eventually he also tells you in Kuntresa Ra'ayot how he reached these conclusions, which are something very often briefly, but he gives you some pointers, which is terribly important and very, very eye-opening frequently. Unfortunately, the Kuntresa Ra'ayot on many of the Masechtot was lost. We do not have it. We happen to have it here on Sanhedrin, Baruch Hashem. So we should most definitely avail ourselves of that which has survived and we are able to study. So the Riaz, having just informed us that he most definitely studied Moreh Nevuchim and many other things that were going on in his day, he lived in Italy. He was aware of these opinions and these ideas, and he knew what Aristotle thought. And he says Aristotle was he was an epikoros, a classic epikoros, in that he rejected nevuah and rejected hashkaha. Everything is entirely according to the workings of the natural material world. And not only is it not likely or reasonable to think that there is a creator who gets involved in such things and changes the course of events, but it's impossible. That's a true materialist. What is a materialist? A person who says there is what counts. The reality is materialism. That's reality. Everything else is just hot air and just talk.
Rabbi?
So therefore, yes.
Do we know why Chazal called that sort of ideology epikorsut and not attributed it to any other philosopher?
From what I understand, it has to do with the fact that this Greek, you could call him a philosopher, I suppose, but he was more particularly a dilettante, really. He was a person who openly and loudly professed his belief that an anti-religion, he conducted a campaign against religion, against any kind of spiritual endeavor or belief, and that the only thing of value is mundane worldly pleasures. And therefore he's in some ways the most... Now Aristotle was actually not that way inclined completely, because although it is reported that he himself was depraved in various ways, but he also obviously valued intellectual endeavor. He thought that science, mathematics, philosophy were a very worthwhile and positive thing for a person to delve into. Epicurus seems to have thought that that's also a waste of time. If you need mathematics because you're an engineer and you have to design a building, all right, fine, so do what you need to do. But essentially, eat, drink, and be merry is the best advice that one can receive. So I think he was more obviously associated with these ideas. It was not. I don't think Chazal chose him as the icon of these ideas, but rather he was known in the Greco-Roman world as the exponent of such a set of ideas. So this Aristotle says the Riaz, and as Rambam himself quotes in Moreh Nevuchim, "Shedat Aristo shehashgahat Hashem tichle el galgal hayoreach." In other words, that Hashem doesn't have any doesn't really control in any way what goes on throughout reality. ועוד כתב שם שכל מה שתראה מענייני בני אדם המתחלפים יחשוב אריסטו שהם במקרה גמור. Anything that you see happen in this world, what happens to this person or that person, what happens to this nation or that nation, it is all entirely, it's purely a matter of chance. Which is again a purely materialist view and perception of reality. There is no possibility, as the Rabbi Abarbanel writes in his Perush at the beginning of Sefer Bereshith, where he attacks not only Aristotle but also Rambam for even spending time discussing Aristotle's views about Olam Kadmon, that the universe simply exists, what was once called a steady state universe. And yes, there's some kind of supreme being or mind within this thing as well, in the reality, but it did not create the universe, and it exists, it coexists with the universe, but did not create the universe. If you believe that, says Rabbi Abarbanel, then you cannot possibly believe in any miracle. There cannot be any miracle of any kind, any time, if you believe only in the physical reality, in the laws of nature. If your view is materialist completely and utterly, then how can there be a miracle? It's not possible. And if you believe that Olam Kadmon, that the world exists concomitantly and separate from Hashem, not because Hashem brought it into being, then Hashem cannot, as Rabbi Abarbanel expresses himself over there, Hashem could not even create the wing of one fly. In other words, the natural world is beyond and separate from him. It's nothing to do with him. He's there, but because they needed to posit such a thing for their own reasons, but the world runs according to its own rules, and no one can interfere, not even God, although not even the Sechel HaRishon, or whatever they called it, the ultimate intellect or something, the first intellect. So the Riaz points out and says about such a view, Zo minuth gemura, this is pure minuth, or atheism, or a rejection of everything that the Torah teaches, and that is true. You can't deny that. She'okeret kol haTorah kula, v'omer leth din v'leth dayan, because such a view tells you explicitly, informs you, and forces you to accept and to believe that there cannot be any divinely ordained and executed justice. There is no judgment. The whole idea of judgment is silly. All you have is physical reality and the laws of nature. وعلو أمر داوود عليه السلام ألماني أسرى شع إلهيم أمر بليبو لو تدرش. In other words, David HaMelech also mentions those kinds of people in the Pasuk, in Tehillim, that there are those who say, Hashem doesn't see, Hashem doesn't care, I can steal, I can... there is discussing highway robbers in that Pasuk in Tehillim. So I can rob, and I can hold people up, and I can kill them, or whatever it is. There's no God to see, and if there is, he doesn't care. That's what some of the Greek philosophers, following the footsteps of Aristotle, would tell you. Yeah, he knows, but it doesn't interest him. So then the world is, as the expression goes in Yiddish, a Hefkewelt. The world is a complete jungle, and there's nothing more to be said. And that, of course, does not lead to a very genial world or society. Usfaro Sifrei Minuth, and all his writings, therefore, Minuth, Walau Alehem, Ne'emar B'Talmud, HaHoreh B'Sfarim HaChitzoniyim, which is also mentioned in the Mishneh here, in this Perek in Sanhedrin. Elu Sifrei Minim, when it says Sfarim Chitzoniyim, it's referring to the Sfarim of the Minim. For instance, it's not referring to an historical work like the first book of the Hashmonaim or Maccabim, which relates to historical events of that time, in the time of the merid of the uprising of the Hashmonaim and the Jewish people against the Hellenists and against the foreign government and power that was ruling over Eretz Yisrael at that time. That's not the Sfarim Chitzoniyim that Rabbi Akiva refers to. It's referring to works that promulgate such ideas as this. Rabbi Akiva היה אומר, ההורה בהם אין לו חלק לעולם הבא. ואפילו אם היו חברו חלוקים עליו, and even if you wish to claim that if it says Rabbi Akiva said this, that perhaps means that others did not say this. ייתכן שחולקים במה שאמר, אין לו חלק לעולם הבא. One can understand that not that any of the Chachamim thought that such ideas are to be entertained or even studied, but they didn't accept perhaps the claim that a person who did so, but they would almost certainly have said, stay away from such things. And that's exactly why there were huge polemical discussions and arguments in the Middle Ages amongst the various Chachamim, and how to relate to the study of philosophy, whether to ban it or not. The Rashba famously authored a heron against studying such things by certain people up to a certain age, what have you. But it was a very hot topic, rightly so, no question. None of this, by the way, should be understood to mean that there are not many very powerful and correct insights to be found in Moreh Nevuchim of the Rambam. There are, no question. But there are also many things that one can take issue with, and that's what Riaz here is getting at, as many other Chachamim did. Aval mikol makom. Asur lahagot bahem. So whether it's pogea when it comes to Olam Haba is one discussion, but it's vadai asur to study such things. Mipnei shenimshach bahem leminuth. That's number one. We're sheshitat haTalmud hi Rabbi Akiva, and furthermore, you should know before you start defending the other view, you should know that the pshat of the sugya in the Talmud is like Rabbi Akiva in Masechet Shavuot. So from here you see that he wrote this before his Psakim Masechet Shavuot, which would indicate that he wrote his Piskei Riaz and the Kuntres Harayot al pi haseder, according to the order of the Talmud, so it would seem from here. وعلى كأله السفرين أمروا على إليشع أحير, the well-known Chacham who became Minan Epikoros, who was known as Elisha Aher, Shayu Sifrei Minim Nosharim Meheko. In other words, he was mitasek. He studied and delved into these works, and they did in fact lead him astray. So there is good reason for Chachamim, various Chachamim in various historical periods, to be very concerned about such things and to warn people away from them. As is mentioned in Chagira, it speaks about certain individual Chachamim who delved into various philosophical, mystical matters. But In other words, they were all in some way harmed by these studies. And if this is the case with regards to the Chachamim HaKadmonim, in other words, Chazal of long ago, and about such people, we hear that generally the results were to be lamented, and the lesson for most people should therefore be clear. לא היו יכולים לעמוד באלה החוכמות, ואף על פי שהיו עסוקים בהם על פי הקבלה. כל שכן הדורות האחרונים שדימו ליבם לנקב המחתותות. In other words, if the hearts, the wisdom of the earlier generations was rahav ke'ulam, in other words, broad, wide like a great hall, as it says in the Talmud, our wisdom in later generations is far less compared to pinprick. שאין יכולים ללמוד בהם, אלא מספרי חכמי האומות, שהם ספרי מינות. I think it should say אלא with a hey, not with an aleph. שאין יכולים ללמוד בהם, אלא ספרי חכמי האומות, שהם ספרי מינות. ואפילו דבר טוב אין ראוי ללמוד מאמינים. And even positive things we should not wish to, and we should not endeavor to study and learn from them. שנאמר החק מעליה דרכך, in Sefer Mishneh, which can and I think should be understood to be referring precisely to Greek thought, comparing it to an Isha Zona and warning Jews away from it. כמו שמפורש בפרק המד עבודה זרה, והוא שאמר הצדיק, again a reference to Eov, אלוהים הבין דרכה. What does that mean? As we said before, שאין דעתו של אדם מסרת באלו החוכמות. Many of these discussions are beyond human understanding, or they cannot be understood correctly by human beings, and therefore they lead people astray. وَأَنُّ لَعَسَوْكَ إِلَّا بَالتَّوْرَاةِ شَهِي يِرَاةَ هَشَمْ وَخَيْنْ أَمَارَ النَّبِيُّ يَهُويَاكِيم مَلَكِ يُهُودَا دَانْ دِين عَنِّي وَأَبْيَانْ أَزْ طَوْ لُو הלא היא הדעת אותי נום Hashem. In other words, doing the right thing is da'at Hashem. Studying Torah is da'at Hashem. And that gives the person the desire and the correct points a person in the right direction. לפי שהיה יהויקים מקל בתורה ובמצוות, והיה מפאר החוכמות שיש בהם ידיעת האלוה, והייתה דעתו כדעת אריסטו. ואמר לו הנביא, ידיעת הבורא אינה אלא לעשות צדקה ומשפט ולקיים התורה. All this is very true, but it needs to be pointed out that in a world that was saturated with Aristotelian thinking, the world in which various Chachamim such as Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon and Rambam and many other Chachamim that we could mention, the Rarbag and Rabbi Histai Kreskas and what have you, many others, in such a world, it was perhaps impossible not to relate to these ideas because they were current. You can tell people, you can put up a sign on the grass saying, "Do not walk on the grass." Correct? But everyone is already on the grass, such a sign does not really help. Or when many people at least are all over the grass, then you need to do something different. So what did the Riaz think about Rambam? He says as follows, As for Rambam, he did deal with these things. Ulai mirov hasidutho v'rov sidkatho, because he was so pious and so wise. It is possible that such a person as Rambam was able to study these things and understand many areas of these within found in these discussions, and was able to glean and attain profound and deep ideas and insights. Nevertheless, he himself was suspected of holding certain views. He spent much time studying these things. Obviously, Rambam did, but obviously also studied many other things. He found just a little bit of time here and there to study the Torah and Divrei Hazal, and to write, as we know, various outstanding works. שכל אדם מתפתה ונמשך ליבו לדבר שהוא מרגיל ליבו תמיד. It's a question of habit. If a person is frequently involved in certain things of this nature, one will become influenced by them, or one will be attracted to them. וגם יש חכמים גדולים מבני עמנו שהרגילו חוכמת ההסתגנינות, which is astrology. ומרוב ההרגל בא, the next word is unclear what it should be. Apparently it should be הכשר. ומרוב הרגל בא והכשר כשקיבלו עליה נמשך ליבם אחריה. So people who studied astrology, and there were many such chachamim, were very much taken with this, with these ideas. ופרשו הרבה ממקראות התורה, based on what they understood from astrology. They understood various things in the Torah in that light. בין חכמי משנה, בין חכמי התלמוד, שכל ישראל חיים על פיהם, הם משבחים ופארים חוכמת התורה על כל דבר. הלא תראה שמואל ירחינאה, שאמר נהירני שבילי דשמיא כשבילי דנהר דעה. Shmuel, the famous Amora Shmuel, who was known as Yarhina'ah for this reason. Milashon Yareach, he was a great astronomer. ואף על פי כן לא היה מתפאר אלא בחוכמת התורה. But he did not pride himself on that, rather only on the knowledge of the Torah. כמפורש בפרק גיד הנשה, as it says in מסכת חולין, ששלח את רבי יוחנן עיבורה דשיטין שני. In other words, he sent Rabbi Yohanan a table laying out for him the עיבור of the next 60 years. שהיה מעבר הוא מדעתו ברוב חוכמתו וברוב חשבונותו. שעיבור השנה היו עושים בית-דין בימים הקדמונים על ידי חשבון, ועל ידי רוב דקדוקים כמפורש לעיל בפרק כמה. Alright, so here the Riaz enters the whole begins to mention here various opinions and ideas regarding Kiddush HaChodesh, etc., which we won't go into for now. I will deliberately gloss over some of the following statements here. The Riaz quotes here from various places in the Talmud that we see that the Chachamim stressed the knowledge of the Torah and Hasidut, which flows from it, from the Torah, rather than any of these other types of Chokhmah. So as he says here, as you can see here, وَلَا يُو, can you see this? وَلَا يُو مَحْشِبِيم ולא היו מחשבים אלא חוכמת התורה בלבד. וכך היו מדמים, שאין הקדוש ברוך הוא משגיח אלא על חוכמת התורה בלבד. But this is the עיקר. וכיוצא באלה תמצא ברוב. וגם תורת משה רבנו עליו השלום, וכל ספרי הנביאים, אינם מוכיחים ואינם מזרזים ואין מלמדים אלא על התורה ועל המצוות. You will not find in the Torah anything about. וכל גם תורת משה רבנו עליו השלום, וכל ספרי הנביאים, אינם מוכיחים ואינם מזרזים ואינם מלמדים אלא על התורה ועל המצוות. What we find is that the Torah encourages us to study the Torah and to live according to the Torah, and doesn't mention the importance of studying Greek philosophy, shall we say. Knowing astronomy, at least up to a point, is necessary for the Torah, for Kiddush HaChodesh, Ibur HaShana, etc. That is true for the calendar, but not various philosophical endeavors. And this is all plain in the wherever you look in the Torah. And there are those who are influenced by various foreign ideas who will then twist Pesukim in order to fit their views. We've discussed such things in the past. Ke'inyan she'osim umat ha'olam, as the nations of the world do, as the Christians do, for example. They twist various Pesukim, verses in the Tanakh, to fit their agenda. Shemapchim divret Torah leminuth, v'hasidim hagedolim ha'ovdim et Hashem me'ahava. The true pious ones who serve Hashem me'ahava, enam al yedei shara chochmot, k'mo shekatav Rabbi Moshe. That is not what leads a person to, usually, in most cases, it's not what leads a person to coming closer to Hashem. In some cases it may, but those are unusual individuals, unique individuals. They are not necessarily to be held up as an example for all. Ela merov hergelan v'hatmadathan b'torah v'misvot. That is what leads to chokhmah gedola and hasidut gedola, to great wisdom and great piety. Ad shenikba bam darkei Hashem ve'en mitkavanim l'davar acher. Perhaps we'll stop here for today. The Riaz continues a bit more. Not a great deal more, I should say, but it's enough for one more Shiur, like today, to complete what we have. It's not much more to complete Kuntres Harayot on this perek. Interesting Torah and Chokhmah from the Riaz on this and in many other matters. I encourage all people to study the Riaz Bichlam as a Chacham Binyanei Halacha.
Rabbi,
yes.
in today's day and age, what do you think our relationship should be to these outside sciences, both in the physical sciences and the philosophy in general?
Well, that's just the point. In the time of Aristotle, science and philosophy were considered much the same. They were empirical science had not really been developed, and when it came to understanding the physical world as well, people such as Aristotle spun theories. They didn't test them really. They spun theories. Maybe they didn't. You could claim they didn't always have the wherewithal to test them. That's also perhaps true. But they would spin a theory. They would theorize. They would come up with an hypothesis or a notion, and they would run with it. And they would and then reach all kinds of conclusions, even theological or spiritual conclusions, which were actually baseless. So that kind of thought has, I think, Baruch Hashem, been left behind. If one wishes to understand how human beings see, is it because the eye emits light or a field of energy which perceives that which is beyond the eye, or whether the light reflected from all those objects is received by the eye and then interpreted by the brain, and then we can make sense of it, which is all actually miraculous. And the more you try and understand that, the more you realize how miraculous it is. That's also very true. But they didn't have any such capability at that time, 2,500 years ago. So what they often considered science was not science at all. It was just meandering human thoughts full of error and confusion and supposition. So supposition is really not of any great value, and you can say the same about many philosophers from that time to the present. that many of their ideas are just the various notions that occur to this or that person at some point. They do not obligate us in any way. They do not teach us very often very much, on the one hand. On the other hand, there are Hachamim in the world. Yesh Chochma b'goyim ta'amin. There is such a thing. And but these things can be tested. We can see, in other words, if a certain philosopher came up with a certain perception, and you see that this explains many things, and the world works that way, and you are therefore now a wiser person having read that, well, okay, there is some benefit to that, perhaps. But how much? The question, of course, is how much time you're going to spend on that, and for whom are these things of value? The truth is, only for a very small minority in a certain intellectual elite can find time and will find any purpose in delving into such things. Most people will not. Rambam, for instance, found himself in a time and a place where many people, anyone who wished to be considered a learned individual, was involved in such studies. But today, try and convince most people in the world today to take Aristotle seriously about on many of the things that he wrote, not perhaps his political treatises and such things, but his perceptions of the physical world, what he would have described as science. We would think these things are or his perception of the universe, of astronomy. We think all that's, we know this not to be true, and we understand that these were simply hypotheses without any experimental or empirical basis. So these things do not interest, quite rightly, do not interest people nowadays. And that's one of the reasons why most people nowadays will not spend a lot of time studying Moreh Nevuchim or Mifhar HaEmunot V'Adeot of Rabbeinu Sa'adia Gaon or other such works, or at least not those parts of those works that deal with such matters. When, on the other hand, Rambam discusses more specifically the Torah and how you should understand certain things of the Torah. Some of those insights and ideas are very profound and very helpful. But how to argue with Aristotle and how to disprove him, most people today would tell you, this doesn't interest me, and they have a point. Now, as for true science, science is not just theory. Science is science. In other words, something which is based on real-world observation, empirical evidence, which can be repeated and which can be shown to be true and is therefore also beneficial, helpful, and allows for progress in various fields. That's what we call science. That is something that we should be involved in. Who should be involved in that? Those people, of course, who are capable and were drawn to those things. And others will not be drawn to those things, are incapable of such intellectual feats and studies, and they won't study that. They'll do something else, and that's fine. That's how the world works. That's the world that Hashem created. All people have their own talents and their own capabilities and their own leanings and predilections, and that's how it should be. But when speaking about, shall we say, essentially, if you take the Darwin's theory of evolution, the truth is that scientifically today it has been demonstrated that it's completely inoperative. It does not work. It's an interesting idea, but Darwin was unable to bring any scientific proof for the essential tenets of his thought. He posited certain ideas, and he said, if I think so, and I think A and B and C and D, then I can also claim E, F, and G. And that's possibly true, but it doesn't prove that it's correct. And by the way, even if you were to accept everything that Darwin said, even though, as I say, much of it has been shown to not work because of a much more correct and accurate and profound understanding of biology and biophysics and biochemistry and what have you, not to mention DNA. It's not Darwin didn't know about DNA because he couldn't know about DNA. And if you cannot explain Darwinian theory in terms of what we know to be true about the essentially digital information contained in the DNA, which is the basis of all living organisms, well then that whole theory basically breaks down. And that's what honest scientists in the field today will tell you. Those who are less honest or have a problem, they cannot really deal with that. So they say, well, you have good questions. We'll work on it some more. But the truth is that the only real explanation is that information comes before the organism, not the other way around. And for a new life form, you need new DNA. DNA is information. Where does information come from? Information comes from intelligence. If I give you a code, a string of letters or numbers which make no sense on the face of it, so you can either reach the conclusion that this is just gibberish, or that it's a code from an intelligent source. But there's no such thing as a code from an unintelligent or non-existent source. So if there is DNA, and there is, and if there's information included in it, which there is, then there is an intelligence behind that. And that alone undermines the essentially atheistic view of reality that Darwin was proposing based on some of his ideas. So the theory of evolution can no longer be considered a valid scientific proposition. It was an attempt to understand certain things at a time when human beings still did not know much that we know today. And it can be set aside. Certain things that Darwin said, nevertheless, are correct or can be correct, might be correct, but not the overall concept, the general picture that from a one-cell organism, everything simply somehow autonomously developed and evolved. That's not possible. That's not doable. A new body plan requires a new set of instructions. So that is science. It's science that disproves the theory of Darwinian evolution, more than even before you speak of the Torah. When it comes to other areas of science, which are real, which are STEM studies, engineering, mathematics, physics based on reality, not hypothesizing about the origin of the universe, which is beyond our ken anyhow. That's therefore not science. That's again philosophy. That's spinning thoughts and ideas without having to take any responsibility for what you're saying, without it being possible to either prove it or disprove it. So that's not really science. That's just talk. Real science is something which can be demonstrated, which can be observed, which can be and also utilized. And those things are important, and the Jewish people must be at the forefront of such things, no question. And there are many people who are so inclined, and they should utilize their God-given talents and abilities for the purpose of understanding Hashem's Bria and propelling forward the Jewish people and science in general to be used for good. We cannot allow ourselves to fall behind other people, especially not our enemies. Tov, we shall end here for today. Rosh Hashanah is upon us, almost. So שנה טובה ומבורכת לנו ולכל בית ישראל בעזרת השם. שלום וניצחון. כל טוב לכם.